Hello class. So today I'm recording a screencast to offer feedback on Kant's Deontology. The work that we've done on Kant's Deontology had to do with answering a couple of questions and forming a formal argument or evaluating a formal argument drawn from what it is that you wrote down. Okay. So it was kind of a complex assignment. So as we near the end of the semester, remember that the assignments will sometimes not always be what we work on for the Zoom meeting. So you want to pay attention to the details of the rubric specifically for the assignment rather than just the prompt for the Zooming meetings that we have. Okay, so we have in our assignment, in approximately 200 words, offer a reply for these questions. How does the practice of fracking align with Kant's non-consequentialism? And I've answered that here, and I'm going to go over that really quick in a second. And here we have what McKinnon and Fiala point out, and I want to touch on that. And then we answered B as well. I have B here. And then I have the formal argument. Okay, so in other words, your assignment should have covered all those parts. Okay, and so I noticed that some students only had parts of the assignment completed. So you want to make sure that you look at all the details of the assignment so as to not forfeit points simply by not doing a certain element that is required. Okay, so let's go ahead and look at A. How does the practice of fracking align with Kant's non-consequentialism? So I just went ahead and wrote an answer here. So A, Kant's ethical theory of deontology is non-consequentialist. In other words, the moral value of Kant's deontology is not based on the consequences of an action. When we consider Kant's non-consequentialism, we must rationally and unconditionally act with goodwill on principle or on good intention and not on the outcome of the action. Now, notice how I have this sentence worded, whereby we are the ones that are applying Kant's non-consequentialism. I noticed a few students were writing that somehow Kant had a certain feeling about fracking or something like that, or he wouldn't consider the consequences. We're looking at an application of Kant's theory. Okay, so we need to have that abstraction in the way that we understand what's going on here. Okay, so we are the ones applying this. Okay, we're using Kant's theory to apply this. So with the practice of fracking, deontologically, we must ask ourselves if such an act is to be universally applicable. So even in the second version is a way we're under the second version of the categorical imperative. We're also understanding whether or not that can be universally applicable as well. Okay, so if we ask ourselves whether or not fracking is to be universally applicable, we are rationally determining the value of fracking as a moral act and as good or bad unconditionally, regardless of consequences. And so we want to make sure that we spell applicable correctly. And so notice too that with this, I'm basically just showing how are we understanding non-consequentialism, and then how does it relate to fracking? Well, with Kant's non-consequentialism, we need to understand that we're acting on principle first and foremost, and can that principle be universally applicable? And that principle is the categorical imperative, etc. Okay, so in other words, we can't get the consequences of fracking confused with the non-consequentialism that we're looking at for the moral theory. So I noticed that proved kind of difficult too for students, is weighing the two. You know, we have the consequences of fracking and then also the problem of non-consequentialism or the ethical theory of not Kant's non-consequentialism, etc. Okay, so there's our answer for that. then let's go ahead and look at what I've pulled out from McKinnon and Fiala. So this is an excerpt from McKinnon and Fiala. So we have here, one way to begin your examination of Kant's moral theory is to think about how we would answer the question, what gives an act moral worth? Okay. So in other words, how is it that we're placing the value of Kant's deontology? Where are we placing that worth? Okay. So it's not the consequences of an act. So in other words, the way in which we're thinking of Kant's deontology is to not base the value of what it is that we're looking at on consequences. So in other words, I noticed some students were keying into the idea of intention or motive, which I thought was good, because that's how it is that we're starting out with our ethical guidance. In other words, it's our duty, it's our way in which we're rationally guiding ourselves toward the right thing to do, right? So we're asking ourselves, can the categorical imperative, either the first or second version, be applied to the situation? And depending on what the situation is, if the answer is yes or right, that determines whether or not the action is good or bad on principle, on rational principle. Okay. So then also here's motive. So we add intention above, and then also McKinnon and Fiala do good to direct us to how we're understanding what is a good motive. What is a good motive is to act with the right intention, with goodwill, to bring about the categorical imperative, right? To always observe. It is our duty to observe the categorical imperative out of duty, etc. That's why we're looking at what's called deontology, okay? The study of duty. So then the answer for B, how would you apply the second version of Kant's categorical imperative to fracking for either the Moore or the Latkinich families, featured in the Should the U.S. Ban Fracking video? Okay, so I've excerpted the second version of the categorical imperative. Always treat humanity, whether in your own person or that of another, never simply as a means, but always at the same time an end. Notice the wording there, always. That's what keys us into this idea that it is, or this rational way in which we're understanding this as universal. Okay, so in other words, you always should do this. And we know that what he means by end here is this idea that people should be respected in and of themselves toward their own ends and not to be used as a means. And this is universally applicable. Okay. So with B, so I've answered the question. Kant's second version of the categorical imperative indicates that we should always treat ourselves and others as an end to be respected unto ourselves, and we should never use others as a means toward our own ends or that of another. Okay, so in other words, we shouldn't use ourselves as a means. We shouldn't offer ourselves as a means for the use of another. We should respect others so as to respect them as ends unto themselves, etc. So then this is our unconditional duty. In other words, it's our non-consequential duty to rationally do so with goodwill. Okay, so that's it right there. In other words, for Kant, it's our duty to do this no matter what. Okay, so even though Chevron paid the Latkinich family for the mineral rights, Chevron used the family as a means to their own profit. This is careless and cannot be universally applied with or without the consequences of damage or property or compromise to health. Now, some students were actually really keen on this interesting part here on the non-consequentialism, to even go as far as pointing out that even the Moore family was being used as a means. So in the video, we had the two families. the Latkinich family was harmed, the Moore family was not. So we could get distracted with those consequences, right? But remember that on principle, we should never use people as a means and always respect them as an end. So therefore, Chevron used the Latkinich family as a means to their own profit, and hence their actions violate the second version of the categorical imperative, because they were using even the Moore family as an end, as a means. So the Latkinich family I used here because they were the party who was harmed. But that harm, remember, is not necessarily a point we should focus on. We're looking at the principle to begin with, okay? Unconditionally, etc. Okay, and so that's 102 words. Then we have the argument itself here that I wanted you to highlight. So this also proved to be somewhat difficult for students. And trust me, I understood that we were just kind of warming up, and that there were difficulties as a result of this idea that you're kind of stepping into an area that perhaps you're not familiar with for a few students. Okay, so when we're thinking of the premises for the argument, we're thinking of how is it that I got to this conclusion? Well, I had to take these steps, and these steps are captured in what I wrote above. Okay, so you want to think about that. What's my overall argument? Well, my overall argument is, therefore, according to Kant's second version of the categorical imperative, the practice of fracking lacks unconditional goodwill because Chevron carelessly used the Latkinich family as a means of profit, and thus fracking cannot be universally applicable. We don't even have to put carelessly there, because Chevron used the Latkinich family as a means of profit, because that's obvious. That, in other words, the idea is that people were being used as a means and not respected as an end unto themselves. Okay. And then so I drew that conclusion from what I wrote up in this for B, this answer for B, and then also the answer for A. Okay, so I took everything I wrote into consideration. They're separated out here. But I took those 2 points and I thought, well, this is my conclusion. So then what were the elements that brought me there? Well, one, so what are the premises? What's the evidence, right? So Kant's deontology is a rational, non-consequential, ethical theory which must always be observed unconditionally, regardless of the consequences. And this is a rational consideration, okay? So prior to our actions, we must take into consideration the responsibility or duty to recognize Kant's deontology here. Okay, so then 2, even though Chevron paid the Latkinich family to frack on their property, the family felt as if they were carelessly used as a means to Chevron's profit and not adequately respected in their own right. And then so notice that with my conclusion has all these elements in it, right? We have the way in which we're thinking of non-consequentialism. We also have reference to the Latkinich family being used as a means by Chevron, and also the application, if I didn't say this, of Kant's categorical imperative, specifically the second version. Okay, so I think that takes us to the end here, and we'll talk more about this in class. Take it from there, and thank you, class. Have a good one.